So we finally got to where we were going, and it was by a bayou, a river, a little water thing, and the big. They had a machine out there in that little river,
Dredging.
dredging.
Okay.
I grabbed her by the legs and pulled her to the water.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only one that I ever killed by drowning.
Once again, it's Murder and Mayhem Monday. Welcome back. My name is Franklin James, the serial author, and I hope you all had a mayhem-less week. Now, when it comes to serial killers, most people know and recognize the bigger names like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Gacy. But there is one man who remains by far one of the most sadistic serial killers to have ever lived. I'm talking about Samuel Little, the choke and stroke killer. And not only was he confirmed by the FBI to have murdered around 50 women, Little himself admitted to actually killing 93 women in total. But perhaps the most unsettling part about his crime spree was how he was able to evade the law until 2012, butchering people for almost 30 years. And Samuel Little got away with his heinous crimes for so long because he didn't look like a monster. In fact, if you passed him on the street, you probably wouldn't give him a second glance. Yet beneath that unsuspecting facade was a pathological predator, a dangerous serial killer who was hiding in plain sight. Now, Samuel Little was born in Reynolds, Georgia in 1940, and he claimed his mother was a teenage sex worker, although official records are murky. And from a psychological standpoint, early instability when it comes to forming attachments, the kind that comes from a consistent caregiver, is a critical risk factor in the development of antisocial behavior. Essentially, a child is going to grow up having a difficult time connecting with others, and they'll have a hard time forming meaningful relationships because they never experienced those things themselves. And perhaps this was the case for Samuel Little. He later described himself as being drawn to violence from a young age, no doubt as a coping mechanism. He was often in trouble at school, and he struggled with authority, and he had a tough time trying to fit in. This would suggest early conduct disorder, which is often a precursor to adult antisocial personality disorder. And here's something interesting. Samuel Little reportedly derived gratification from the physical dominance he left over women, even in adolescence, which is a chilling indicator of what's known in forensic psychology as a paraphilic coercive disorder. It's a form of paraphilia where the victim's terrified resistance is a source of sexual pleasure. However, by the time Samuel Little reached adulthood, he had already built quite the rap sheet, which involved theft, assault, and even attempted rape. He preyed primarily on marginalized women. He preyed on sex workers, drug users, women living in poverty, people who wouldn't necessarily be missed. His crimes, they weren't just opportunistic, they were strategic. He knew these women were less likely to have their cases investigated. Samuel Little would be classified as an organized offender because he was careful, methodical, and knew how to avoid detection. He had been doing it for years. He knew how to blend in. And the way he strangled his victims, it was intimate for him. It was up close and personal. For many offenders, strangulation is about power and control, not just death. It's about feeling godlike. And Samuel Little admitted that he liked watching the light leave his victim's eyes. For him, that was gratifying. So those women, they were surrogates, symbolic stand ins for his mother. Those victims, they allowed him to act out any repressed anger or rage. But sensations like that never last long. So he was constantly searching for that feeling over and over again, killing countless women. Now, from a psychological lens, one of the most striking things about Samuel Little is how normal he seemed between murders. He was a transient, drifting from state to state, living out of his car, painting portraits of his victims, and boxing for money. He was arrested dozens of times, but he still flew under the radar, partly because of his victimology, the women he targeted, and partly because he didn't fit the classic serial killer mold that law enforcement was looking for at the time. But mostly, he knew how to manipulate the system. He minimized, lied, and charmed. Hallmarks of psychopathy, like glibness, superficial charm, and a profound lack of guilt and empathy. But in 2012, thanks to modern technology, a DNA match finally caught up with him. He was arrested and convicted of 3 murders in California, but it wasn't until later in prison that Samuel Little began confessing, and not just to a few murders, but dozens. And what's eerie is that he remembered everything. He sketched portraits of the women, and they were detailed images of crimes decades old, which tells me his crimes weren't impulsive, they were rituals. He savored them, and these portraits allowed him to relive what he had done. Yet in the end, Samuel Little died in 2020, but his legacy, if you can call it that, is still being uncovered. The FBI continues to verify his confessions, and families continue to grieve long forgotten losses. Samuel Little wasn't born a monster. He was a man shaped by chaos, driven by compulsion, and hidden by indifference. And while we can never fully explain what creates a killer like this, we can look closer because maybe, just maybe, the next time we'll see all the signs before it's too late. But I want to thank you all for tuning in. And I do ask that you stab that like button and subscribe. Leave a comment and let me know what you think about Samuel Little. Share this video out there, hit that bell for notifications, and if possible, avoid mayhem.